In the case you have any questions in between, just write them into the chat and we can have a short chat within the lecture. I think that makes a lot of sense because maybe I will use some terms, or maybe you're actually an expert in this field and you would like to share your insights so that we can have it a little bit more interactive. At the end of these three case studies, at each end, I will also raise you some questions. So we don't have to discuss them after each case, but just to keep them in mind, why I'm actually presenting these cases and how they also relate to each other. So starting with the short introduction to political ecology, I'm sure that some of you have heard about political ecology. Some of them probably also used that in their studies already. So it's something pretty broad. It's an interdisciplinary scholarship focusing on power relations, or on the power-laden social construction of nature. It's an explicit normative discipline. So for instance, Robbins was arguing that it's a discipline to plant the seeds for reclaiming and asserting alternative ways of managing nature. So it's actually also a discipline that could help us to find ways to a more sustainable future. And it's a discipline that seeks to go beyond dominant ontologies of nature and culture. And what is meant here with dominant ontologies, for example, in most modern ontologies, you would classify a forest as a forest, something that consists of trees that you can actually chop down, or you can walk to the forest because of the scenic beauty of the forest. But for example, for indigenous communities in many parts of the world, a forest is sometimes more than just a forest. It's a place where they have specific relations to. Maybe the forest is a place where their ancestor spirits live. Maybe the forest as such has a certain name, or so in these ontologies, the forest is not about resources. The forest is maybe even part of the families, for example, of these indigenous communities. And what you can see here first on the picture, that is a picture that I took in Jambi. And there you can see to some extent, not necessarily the different ontologies, but how actually power-laden social constructions of nature are inscribed in the landscape. What you can see here is the village border of Bunku. So you see a white border stone, and in the back you see the border of the Tahura Senami, and you see the green sign welcoming more or less to the Tahura, and then you see the red sign with certain prohibitions. And here you see how actually this power asymmetries, this power relations are inscribed in the landscape. We see these two borders, and you see actually in this specific case here that people are actually living on both sides of the border of the state forest. So you can continue to see this picture on the next slide as well, because here it also serves as a good example. Political ecology explores the production of different politicized environments in the context of specific power constellations. And for example, a village territory, or the territory of a city or a nation state, this is a politicized environment. You have certain values in place. You have certain dominant ways of using natural resources. You have certain authorities that manage different kinds of resources, that provide access to resources, that issue land titles, for example. And you have also here on the picture, as I said before, the border of the state forest. And this is a very specific politicized environment because it's a specific part of this environment which is dedicated for forest use, or in this case, for conservation. I will show you a few other examples. What is meant here with contested environments, and also with the idea of politicized environments. You see here also a picture from Sumatra. You see an oil palm plantation, which has been occupied by indigenous communities. And here you actually see how contested the place is just on this picture. Now you see in the front, there's a small green sign, which you probably cannot read, or at least I am not able to read it right now because the quality is not good enough. But This small green sign actually is saying that this is the land of PT Asiatic Persada. So it was at that time a company owned by Wilmar International. And then you see in the back the banner of the Suku Anak Dalam, and they welcome people to their land. But at least in formal terms, because the plantation company, they received the concession from the National Land Agency, this land is owned by the plantation company. So you can see here that there are overlapping land claims, which are also related to like different understandings of nature, different ways of relating to nature. For the Suku Anak Dalam, this is part of their ancestral land. So at least they claim that their ancestors have been living in these areas for centuries. They have practiced shifting cultivation, they've had fruit tree gardens, and then in contrast, the oil palm company has a more monocultural way of managing the forest, and they established these kind of oil palm plantations. Then you see a port, which is also a highly politicized environment. This is the port of Hamburg. The port of Hamburg is the third largest port in Europe and the biggest port in Germany. It's obviously much smaller than the big Asian ports like Singapore, for example, or Hong Kong, but in Europe it's relatively, it's the third largest port. And you see the big container ships in the back, you see the container terminals. And this port is also a highly politicized environment. Actually, to maintain the port, you have to continuously dredge the river, that actually these ships can enter the port. And this creates huge environmental impacts, and I will talk later about that, affecting, for example, the abilities of fisher to actually catch fish in the area, because there was too much dredging all the years, and this has a negative impact on the abundance of fish, for example, and it has a negative influence, for example, on the oxygen concentration. But what you can see is actually that the container terminal on the back here visualize that the port use and the use of this river as a navigation channel for large container ships is much more important than fishery in this area. Another important aspect when taking a political ecology perspective is that nature is produced by society through practices, through linguistic and scientific meanings, but nature still has a biophysical and material basis, with inherent physical processes. And I will take you again to northern Germany to illustrate this a bit. What you can see here is actually the Elbe estuary, so the Elbe River. And you see how dynamic this ecosystem is. You see there are floodplains, there are marsh islands, there are tidal flats. It's a tidal influenced river. And you also see industry in the back, to see some power plants. And this contested environment, going just back to the definition. So we call it an estuary, we call it a river, but we also call it a waterway. And this idea of the waterway is actually that a river has certain functions, like actually a road is operating. For a shipping company, a waterway is like a road. It has to be maintained. That's why referring to practices here. So actually this specific production of nature, so this estuary has to be maintained to actually allow ships to travel through this estuary. If you would stop dredging today, then just a few weeks later, it would be impossible for the largest container ships to call at the port. Because like a road has to be maintained continuously. If you stop maintaining a road, then after a certain while, depending on the climate, it would be relatively difficult actually to still use that road for cargo traffic, for example. But what you can also see here is this nature that is highly dynamic. And for conservationists, for example, this area is very, very important because it's one of the very few areas in Europe where you have freshwater tidal swamps. And there are very few species that live in these zones, which are also endemic. And if dredging would continue permanently, if they would deepen the river once and once more, the salt water would get farther inland and might actually displace these kind of species. Also important to consider from a political ecology perspective is that space. So now going even more abstract, now before it was nature, now it's space as such itself may be primordially given, but the organization and the meaning of space is a product of social translation, transformation, and experience. And I took this quote here from Edward Sawyer, and he based his arguments mainly on Henry Lefebvre's work. And an important aspect here is, again, this aspect of transformation and social translation. So first of all, transformation takes actually place through human labor. So by our activities, we're transforming space and we're creating what Lefebvre has called second nature. But then we also assign meanings to space. No? So we have cities, we have forests, we have a parking lot, a market. So we transform these places, we create markets, for example. I'm not referring here to financial markets, but you can also use this as an example, just a market where you buy fish, for example. This market is created. We have certain words to describe these markets. So we create a meaning here. We create the market through labor. And in that way, we also experience this area. No? So we walk through the market. We have social interactions at the market and so on. Another example, for example, would be this forest area here on the island of Sumatra, where you have actually a quite contested space. So for a person that has not much knowledge on tropical forests, that would maybe just assume, oh, this looks like a nice patch of forest. For conservationists, this area might actually look like a forest at risk, because what you can see in front is that there is even a shelter, there are banana leaves, and you can also see in the back that this area has no closed canopy, for example. So what I want to stress here is that you see certain meanings, that certain meanings are contested, that certain actors are probably more powerful to insert their meanings, and also to inscribe their meanings into the landscape. And these landscapes are often arenas of ongoing struggles over resources. And this is not necessarily something bad. No? If these struggles are not violent, if you have certain decision-making processes that mediate conflicts, conflicts are not necessarily something bad. So actually conflicts, they show actually that a society is quite vibrant, that we have different perspectives, and that there is actually place in civil society to discuss about these issues. No? So that we don't, it's not necessary that we all have the same opinion on how to manage a forest. So conflict as such is not necessarily something bad, of course. A violent conflict, of course, is a bit different. And land use conflicts are quite often articulations of changing social relations of production, but also of power relations. So for example, a new crop is introduced to an area. This might create certain tensions. If a decentralization process is implemented, this changes local power relations, and also change the way or the persons that benefit from access to resources. And a landscape quite often has all these features. Right? You have certain crops that are related to a different mode of production, to a specific mode of production, for example, oil palm cultivation. You have smallholder, you have large-scale commercial oil palm cultivation, you have conservation, or you have port use. And you all see that in the landscape, and this all reflects certain power relations in that landscape. Do you have any questions to this first introductory part before I would take you to Germany?
Okay, so for students, is there any question for Dr. Jonathan? Student that joining us in the room, is there any question? Okay, there is one question. Is that okay?
Yes, of course. We can have 1 or 2 questions and then we continue. Yes, please.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Jonas. It's very interesting about the political ecology in Indonesia, right? If we discuss about the political ecology, so we discuss about who get the benefit and who get the impact of the what we call it. It's like business or etc. So how about your opinion about the oil palm plantation in Indonesia? Many impact give on the rural area, but the people have get more benefit impact for economic, for example. So what do you think about that? Thank you.
I think you summarized it already in a perfect way. So it has definitely welfare effects now, which are really important in many rural areas now. It has definitely also environmental impacts when it comes to water resources. For example, there are a number of studies showing declining biodiversity. There are obviously also negative impacts, so it has certain trade-offs. No? It creates welfare benefits for society, but this comes to certain costs, as actually most land uses are. No? So this is nothing specific to oil palm, I would say. You have the same issue in other parts of the world with other crops or with other practices that create certain welfare effects. That is one of the problems that we have right now. How can we actually transform societies in a way that we're actually able to keep a certain level of welfare, but that this welfare does not come to the expense of environmental destruction. So maybe we just add there a second question and then we continue.
Yeah,
I just saw a hand.
There is another question from our student that is joining us via offline in this room. So for the student, you can ask the question. Yes.
Thank you for the chance to give some questions. So I saw that space in itself may be primordially given, but the meaning of space is product of social transformation.
Yes.
So I want to ask you about what is the meaning of the definition of space in our Earth. Is it the land, or is it the nature life, or what? Thank you.
Okay, yeah, thank you for the question. Space is actually everything around us. We live in space. And the important argument here is that this space is first of all primordially given, so there is something material in it, but that this space only makes sense for us if first of all we create certain meanings about that space. We describe that space. We create names, so we tag space with names. We transform space by labor. So, and Lefebvre's argument is that there was probably something that was primordial, pristine, not touched material space, which was then transformed through labor. And in the due course of this transformation process, we also attach meanings to that space.
So to clarify your explanations, we as humans are space also, right?
Excuse me? Could you repeat that, please? Okay, he's gone. Okay, maybe we just take that up.
Did my sound, can you hear my sound? Can you hear my sound?
Yes, now it works, yeah. Yeah, I would say let's take that up later at the end of the discussion, and we continue. And this, I think, this issue will remain important, how we think about space throughout the lecture. So I will take you to Hamburg now. So this is Germany. Here are the Netherlands. That's Amsterdam here. This is Hamburg. This is the Elbe estuary. So on the other map, you can see Hamburg and the Elbe estuary. And then there is a small map showing the port area. As I said, it's like the third largest port in Europe. It's the largest port in Hamburg. It's part of the so-called North Range ports. So usually, for example, container ships that come from China, they first call at Le Havre in France, then they might go to Southampton in London, then they usually go to Antwerp or Amsterdam, and then they go to Hamburg, and then they usually go back, or maybe they call at the Baltic Sea somewhere, or so all these container ships usually take that route. So, and for the German export industry, this is a quite important port, and it's also an important port for the whole Baltic Sea region, because usually the large container ships, they call in Hamburg, and then the containers are distributed to smaller feeder ships, and these feeder ships then take the goods to many other ports in the North Sea and Baltic Sea region. So it's a quite important port, and the city of Hamburg has a very long history that is deeply intertwined with maritime trade, dating back to like around 800. And it's an area that has been shaped by this interaction between land and sea. So land was reclaimed, then dangerous storm surges killed many people, destroyed land. Then again, we had land reclamation, construction of dikes, and then starting with industrialization, the river was continuously dredged that actually the larger ships can enter the port. And what I also said and already said in the beginning, actually to maintain the accessibility, the Elbe, that is the river, has to be dredged continuously. And the latest round of dredging to actually was just completed in 2019. So we have to distinguish here. We have permanent dredging that takes place permanently to maintain the waterway. And then every couple of years, when new larger container vessels have been developed, the port industry wants that the river once more will receive a deeper fairway, will receive a deeper navigation channel. And this last round of deepening the navigation channel was just completed. And it was one of the longest environmental conflicts in Germany, as only, for example, the court proceedings took 17 years. So which is really a very, very long process, I would say, 17 years. And starting point of the study that I did together with a bachelor student, and we published the paper in Environmental Planning, Nature and Space. So I will also send you a couple of texts after the lecture. We were actually asking, why is this conflict so contested? So that was actually our starting point. Why does it take so long to come to a decision here? And we then looked into, first of all, the different interests that actors have in the area. So I talked about the port industry. For them, the river is a waterway. They want to bring their container ships in. This waterway has to be deep enough that the large container vessels, now the largest vessels, the largest container vessels are able to reach the port. Then we have fisher in the area. There are very few left, but there are still some fisher. And for them, of course, this is an important catchment area. They're on the river for a half a day, spend their days on the river looking for fish. Then this, you see here the plantation, which is an apple tree plantation. This is an important rural land use practice at the shores of the estuary. And the farmers actually use the water because, as I told you at the beginning, this is still fresh water. It's tidal influence, but it's fresh water. They use that water for irrigation. and even more important than irrigation, they use it for frost protection in the winter. So in the winter when it's freezing, or especially in the spring, when the apple trees create their blossoms, then you need, if then the temperature drops below 0, the farmers have to protect the trees, and then they use water for that. And then you see here these 2 trees and the swampy landscape. I used this picture to illustrate the interests of the conservationists, and they argue that this landscape is one of the very few relatively intact estuaries in Northwestern Europe, and they're always arguing against dredging because they're afraid of saltwater intrusion. They're afraid of the extinction of important species. And saltwater intrusion is already becoming an important issue. And this is also a challenge, for example, for the fruit tree cultivators, because you cannot use salty water for irrigation, and you cannot use salty water to protect the trees from late frosts. And then for looking actually deeper into the conflict, we were asking us, so as I said in the beginning, why is this conflict so intense? Why did it took so long? And then we argue that it might be interesting to analyze specific narratives on the river, on the estuary, and to analyze the narratives and to look actually which position do different actors have in these narratives. Then to look into practices, so shipping, for example, fishery, fruit tree cultivation, and then to look into knowledge claims. And we argue that actually to look into narratives, knowledge claims, and practices help us to identify what is actually at stake. So to think of the ontology of the estuary. So what is the estuary actually? So what is the conflict about? It's not only about dredging, no? It's about the estuary as such. Is it an estuary for the shipping industry, or is it an estuary for the fisher, for example? And we were arguing then, based on Mario Blaza, that narratives have world-making effects and contribute to the performance of reality. Narratives not only describe events, they enact them. They are interpersonal and contribute to the production of identities by relating them to time, space, and social practices. And we argue that these different ontologies, so different worlds, no, or different assumptions of what exists, and the different multiple ways of viewing and knowing the world occur within and across societies and influence planning processes and conflicts. And these authors that I mentioned, this author Mario Blaza, for example, and a few others that have shaped the so-called ontological turn, argue that there is not only one order of things, but multiple orders of things. And this ontological perspective on environmental conflict shifts the focus from trying to explain why differences arise to the study of how objects come to be in a relational, multiple, fluid, and more or less unordered and indeterminate set of practices. And I will give you a few examples more what actually that means and entails in a minute. And there we also have to distinguish between ontology, so between the multiple ways of viewing the world, or the different assumptions of what exists as such, and the multiple ways of knowing the world. And environmental knowledge is a specific way of describing the relations between so-called specific biophysical variables within the estuary. And this environmental knowledge is not only produced by researchers, no, but also by planners, governments, by lay people, as the fisher, for example, by resource users, by consultants, by modeling exercises conducted by researchers, but also by governmental agencies. And all these different actors, they have something to say about the apparent causal connection between, for example, dredging and perceived changes in the estuary, for instance, saltwater intrusion. And these knowledge claims, they relate to the way of seeing the estuary. So for example, the port industry that considered the estuary mainly as a federal waterway, not like a road for container ships. Their main practice is, first of all, like navigating the ships, but this practice is associated with dredging, with deepening the river, maintaining the water depth. And for example, the associated governmental agencies, they argue, for example, that saltwater intrusion is not caused by dredging, but is caused by lower runoff during dry season. We have experienced some very dry summers in Europe. The last one was also one of the driest ever. And during this dry summers, we have less fresh water coming down the river. So the Port Authority argues that it's actually not about dredging, it's because of the dry summers. And this knowledge claim is associated with a specific worldview. The worldview actually that this estuary is for container ships. And this reflects also the power relations along the estuary. So showing you the map again, some rough informations about the methods that we used for the study. So we used qualitative interviews with the actors that I mentioned, for example, with the Hamburg Port Authority, for example, with the Federal Waterway Agency, with environmental NGOs, with Fisher, and we used a qualitative and quantitative content analysis of newspaper articles. And we used this then as a basis to look into these different practices and narratives and knowledge claims on the estuary. And that was all relatively abstract, and this will actually translate into something relatively simple. So now we'll describe you different narratives or knowledge claims of these different actors and how they actually see the estuary. So as I said, for the port industry and the project proponents, the estuary is a federal waterway. And think about the waterway as a road, but it's for ocean-going vessels. Dredging is required to maintain the waterway. Then especially the Federal Waterway Agency was arguing from the very beginning that river deepening is something water level neutral in their case. They argue that they're deepening, this creates an impact, but then they compensate in other places, and this would lead to something overall neutral. It will not create significant environmental impacts. And then we see also that those actors also are concerned about the environment. For example, the argue project proponents explicitly highlight the low carbon footprint of ocean vessels based on transport in comparison to road transport. Then these actors argue that this intervention is urgently needed to maintain the waterway, the success of the port, the city, and even the nation. And this is something quite interesting because we quite often see that when it comes to large infrastructure projects, that people that are in favor of these projects, they try to relate their narratives to bigger issues. So first, it's not just the port, it's not just the city. It's at least a relatively big city for in Germany. It's the second largest city as well. But then it's not only the city, the success of the port is even important for the nation. So you can probably even argue that it's important for Europe. I'm not necessarily questioning that, but I'm just want to show you that people use these categories here to legitimize their approach. Because if something is so important that even the nation depends on the success of the port, that makes it obviously much more difficult to raise criticism. Then, for example, on the fruit tree cultivation, they argue it's anyway not sustainable to do that. It creates land subsidence, an issue that you have also quite a lot in northern Java, the land subsidence problems. And they argue it does not create additional storm surge risks. And this is of course, also quite contested. No? Then the fruit tree cultivators. They argue that the intrusion of salt water, as caused by the river dredging, by the fairway adaptation, endangers irrigation and the use of elbow water to protect trees against late frosts. So for them, the causal chain is totally clear. No? So we dredge the river, we have more salty water in the river, we cannot use the water anymore. Then they argue, and here they also relate fruit tree cultivation to something bigger. They refer the intervention endangers fruit tree cultivation and the colonized marshes. So these marshes have been colonized centuries ago with the support of Dutch specialists. And they argue that if you would actually stop fruit tree cultivation, then you would actually put the whole marshlands at risk. And then they argue that earlier dredging had negative impacts on storm surge protection. And the people living in the northern German marshlands are highly concerned about storm surges. There was a very, very deadly storm surge in 1962. And there were many before. And people are well aware that actually the North Sea is a quite dangerous place when you have storm surges. No? Then you have the fisher. And for them, the Elbe is, or at least was in the past, an interesting fishing area where saltwater and freshwater species occur. So this is, of course, something quite interesting for a fisher. No? If you find species that occur only in rivers, usually, and you find species that you find in the ocean. They argue dredging destroys the estuary and transforms the estuary into an artificial waterway. They argue the estuary is highly dynamic, but it's dying. So here that's interesting also that they argue to some extent that the estuary is a living being, because only living beings can die. As a result of the intervention, the currents are changing constantly, making it difficult to anchor and form a calm paths, while in some shallow water areas, mud is accumulating and fishing is impossible. And they argue that low oxygen levels are caused by the intervention. And based on these narratives, we then came up with the notion that we have multiple estuaries here, multiple ontologies of the Elbe, because these narratives are so different and they relate to so different knowledge claims that we suggested there might be something more than just thinking about epistemology, than just thinking about power asymmetries, that actually there's different ways to relate to the estuary, the different practices and narratives, they produce different estuaries, of course, all within the same materiality. We don't argue that there are now 3 Elbe rivers. There is still just one Elbe river. No? And then what is interesting is, and what you also have in many large-scale infrastructure projects, and that's why I put the computer here, that you have different kinds of knowledge produced, for example, through modeling. And models do not create empirical knowledge. No? This is something that we always have to keep in mind. Sometimes this information gets lost at the science policy interface, but we all researchers, we know that models are not creating empirical knowledge. Sometimes we use empirical knowledge, or quite often, to feed models, but models as such are not doing that. But these models are quite important for the production of these ontologies. Then we have the experiential knowledge, for example. The fisher, as I said, no, they're on the river all the day. They don't use knowledge, they don't use computer models, but they see how the river is changing. And one of the issues is that quite often only the academic or science-based knowledge is actually considered in these planning processes, and not the knowledge of those that are all the day on the river. So that was actually the example from Germany. And I close you just with a number of questions that you can keep in mind. Also when looking into other conflicts. So what kinds of environments are produced? Which practices produce environments? And which narratives are used? And what is the position of actors within these narratives? Why is knowledge and ontology so contested? And what kinds of implications has this, for example, for environmental justice? So I think we can also like take one or two questions before continuing.
Okay,
If there
so
are
for
some.
student, is there any question? The student that joining us in the Zoom, you can write the question in the chat or you can raise your hand. So for the student that joining us in the room, is there any question? So for the student that join us in the room, is there any question? So for the student that join us in the room, is there any question? So for the student that join us in the room. Okay, so there are several students. There are several questions.
Just take 2 or 3, no? Because we need some time also at the end.
Okay, so maybe for the first, Graciela.
Okay, ma'am, thank you. I want to ask, on the slide before it was said that nature is produced with through linguistic. What is linguistic meaning, and what does it have to do with nature? Thank you.
Okay, that's linguistic means you just like language practices. So you when you see of this, for example, we can use the pictures that we have here. So for the fisher, this is an area where you can catch fish, and they use that in their day-to-day language. They talk about catching fish, and for them, the estuary is an area where you take fish. For the port industry, the estuary, and they also, when they talk about the Elbe, the captain of a container ship is not talking about the fish in the river. Maybe if he's also like doing that from time to time, but most of his conversations will deal about this specific waterway, which is also a quite problematic waterway for captains, no? Because it has a narrow fairway, you have the tidal influence and so on. No? So that's what I mean with linguistic practices. So there is also a different language. So fisher have their own terms to talk about the estuary, and captains, for example, they also have their own terms. And this creates, not necessarily in material terms, but this creates different environments. And of course, both actors also transform the environment in material terms. No? The fisher take out the fish. They maybe also make certain changes in the estuary by taking out the fish. And the captain of a large container vessel, this container vessel creates huge waves, and all the dredging that is necessary for permitting the vessel to call at the port transforms the environment.
Okay, so thank you for the question. And then the second question from Zahra Afnanakia. Also for Zahra, it actually she is joining us in the offline class, so she will ask directly to the Dr. Jonathan.
Okay, thank you for change. You have explained about the estuary, and my question is, they can decide that estuary is the most productive area, and please explain why from your question, from your answer. Thank you.
Could you repeat that question? Maybe could you switch off the microphone, the other microphone in the room, but because there was an echo, and then I might be able to understand you. So now it should work. Just try again, please.
I will just ask my question. So you have been explained about the estuary, and my question is, can it be said that the estuary is the most productive area? And please explain why from your answer. Thank you.
Maybe type it into the chat. I'm sorry, I was not able to, to understand it.
Yeah, so maybe Zahra, you can remove your mask. Okay.
And you answer my question. My question is, you have been explained about the estuary. My question is, can it be said that the estuary is the most productive area? And please explain why from your answer. Thank you.
You mean productive area?
Yeah, estuary.
The estuary. I was sorry. The sound in the room is sometimes difficult.
Yeah. So maybe Zahra want to ask about the estuaries, and she want to know, is that estuaries area is the most productive one or not? And if it is the productive one, why the estuaries area is the productive one? Maybe that's the question of Zahra.
Okay. Yeah, the estuary is pretty important in many terms. No? So it's the location of the port. It's important for so they are also taking water out of the estuary for industrial use. It's very important in ecological terms because you have this tidal influenced swamps where a lot of biomass is generated, where you also carbon is stored and things like that. So I'm not sure if I got the question correctly, but so maybe we take one or two more and then we move on.
Okay. So Zahra, is the question answer your question about the estuaries?
Yes, that answer my question.
Okay, so thank you for Zahra and thank you for Dr. Jonathan. Actually, is already answered the question. We move to the another question, or you will continue your presentation?
I think we can take one more and then we continue.
Okay, so one more question from Muhammad Amirul Azhar. Okay, he is the one that joining us in the class. So Muhammad Amirul Azhar, you can ask the question.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity to ask a question. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to ask a question. Is there any method the government used in the past for using the nature is gift that we Indonesian people can learn from it?
I think we can both learn from each other. No? So I think there might be many ways for exchange in like an environmental cooperation where we can both learn. So I don't think that the way the decisions on the Elbe estuary were felt are something where Indonesia could learn something from, no? Because it was, from my perspective, at least for someone that is concerned in environmental issues, not a very well-developed process. No? There might be other fields where Indonesia could learn something from environmental policies in Germany, but I think also definitely also the other way around. So I think that is a field where we can meet and discuss about different types of policies that might work in Germany, that might work in Indonesia, and the other way around. Thank you for these questions. I think we can. So let's continue. And then I will take you to Colombia. So we go at least for the south. We're still very far away from Indonesia. And here we'll talk about forest conservation, REDD+, and peasant colonization in the Colombian Amazon. And what I will present here is the product of joint research that I did together with my Colombian colleague, Giancarlo Rodriguez de Francisco. He is also working at IDOS and with colleagues from Universidad Javeriana in Bogota, so with Carlos del Cairo and his team. And this research took place in 2017. And I think most of you probably know what REDD+ is. So what I will just, REDD+ is reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation. It's a mechanism developed by the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And the general idea is to create financial incentives for expanding forest conservation. So we move now from the estuary, from the coastal space, far inland. And the basic assumption is that you have a certain deforestation level in an area, and when you have an intervention, a conservation project, or an economic incentive, then deforestation would go down, and you would this would lead to emission reductions. And this mechanism was first discussed, or first part of the first discussed in Montreal. And then it was formally part of the UNFCCC negotiation process after the COP 2007 in Bali. So then it was introduced to the so-called Bali Roadmap at that time. And it's to some extent now fully negotiated. So a few years ago, the parties to the convention agreed on the Warsaw framework on REDD+. But some issues remain still unclear. So the funding mechanisms, for example, will it be part of a market or not, and things like that. But in some areas, it is relatively influential when it comes to land use decisions. And nowadays, people are talking more about nature-based solutions. So this is a new term, but I will not go into detail, but probably you heard about the term. And I would consider that REDD+ is one of these so-called nature-based solutions to mitigate and to adapt to changing climate. And I will start here with a quote from McGregor. It's an Australian-based political ecologist. And he argued that, in my view, REDD might eventually become as important to forest management as the Green Revolution was to agriculture production. Just as the Green Revolution introduced global agribusiness to rural spaces in developing areas, under the rubric of food scarcity, REDD seeks to introduce large amounts of carbon finance to forested spaces of non-annexed countries, so of mostly countries in Africa, South America, and Asia, under the discourse of climate change. And I think now, 12 years later, it turned out that it's probably not as important as the Green Revolution, but in some areas, it's still very significant, and it really changes the ways of people, the ways of relating to forests, the ways of using forests, or in broader terms, the geographies of resource access. And as I said, I will focus on Colombia here, so on the province of Guaviare, which is in the Colombian Amazon. And Colombia negotiated a so-called result-based REDD+ scheme with funded by Germany, Norway, and the UK. And these payments are shared in a specific way. So like 60% should be used for local implementation. And the project is implemented in the post-conflict situation. So many of you know probably that Colombia and was suffered from a very long civil war, and that in 2016 the government at that time reached a landmark peace deal with one of the guerrilla, with the rebel organizations, with the FARC. And since then the situation became more stable, but there's still areas which are affected by civil war, by crimes of narco business, and this peace deal was also not reached with all guerrilla organizations, with all rebel groups. So there are some that are still fighting. And this Red Plus project had a very broad vision. So the idea was to actually now use this peace deal as a way to actually develop the Colombian Amazon into a model region for green growth and low carbon development, and to actually support indigenous communities and smallholders, so support actually marginalized communities that have been marginalized by the state for centuries. So the idea was to use this international resources, or this resources from this Red Plus deal that Germany, Germany, Norway, and UK agreed to finance that program. In the case Colombia is able to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions. And this program, and that is something important, was just one of many attempts to actually transform the Amazon. So first of all, the Amazon was considered as an empty space, a place where people can go to get land. And this was also supported by the state to actually strengthen the structures of the state at the state's periphery. So then we had, for example, the rubber boom. We had different land allocation schemes, where actually in the 1960s we had state-sponsored peasant colonization schemes. In Indonesia, you had the Transmigrasi program, and there we had similar programs. So at that time, forest as such was not valued. It was rather valued to expand agricultural production areas. And at this time, indigenous people were considered as backward forest dwellers, and peasants were considered as heroes of the country, because they were actually expanding colonization, they're expanding civilization to the Amazon. Then we had the 1990s, when we had the violent civil war, and from that on, peasants were rather considered as a risk, because some of them were growing coca, some of them were aligning with the rebel groups, and so peasants were considered as risks for the state, but also for forest conservation. And then after the peace deal, actually indigenous groups, or actually also after the 1990s, indigenous groups were considered as allies of conservationists and peasants as risks. And now with this Red Plus and Amazon Vision, the idea was to fully transform the region into a model region for sustainable development. I think we can skip that map, because it's not, it just shows the province again and different land use categories and the two regions where we did our field research. But despite of this intervention, we have a number of issues. The deforestation rate is rising. Land use change is too complex for simple monetary interventions. We have a power void after the retreat of the FARC. So the FARC was the rebel group. We had the peace deal, but then the state was not actually able to fulfill all the functions that the FARC did before. So for instance, the FARC also had regulations on land use and forest conservation. And then the FARC left after the peace deal, but then the new regulations of the state were not implemented. And this led to a situation where you had land speculation, agrarian expansion driven by organized crime. And then we had this RED program, this REM, that creates support for peasants. But these peasants were actually not the drivers of deforestation. The drivers of deforestation are these kind of land speculations. So surrender means to buy. So actually, people were grabbing land in many parts of the province to sell that either for like holiday homes or for agribusiness or for cattle ranching. So despite of this conservation program supported by UK, Germany, and Norway, deforestation was actually accelerating. And it was also accelerating because people were also continuing to grow coca to some extent. So one of the pictures show you a coca plantation, but also because of agribusiness, and this was the most important driver, which you can see here is an oil palm plantation. Agribusiness and cattle ranching were very important drivers in challenging this program. And you might wonder that this section on Colombia was pretty descriptive. So here, it was probably not as conceptual, but I think the same questions are relevant. So what kinds of environments are produced? Are you, are actors actually conserving forests to maintain forest? Or is it rather an agribusiness environment that is produced? Which practices again produce these environments? Are these indigenous land use practices by small peasants, or of agribusiness? Or is it cattle ranching that is producing environments here? And which narratives are used, and what is the position of actors within these narratives? So I refer to the indigenous groups, for example. In the past, indigenous groups were considered as backwatered forest dwellers. No? So actually people that have to learn how to farm. And nowadays, the state and also environmental NGOs are considering indigenous communities as those that actually have conserved the forest for centuries, and then we have actually to learn from them how to manage forests in a sustainable way. And peasants, on the other hand, at the beginning, they were considered as heroes of the nation because they bring civilization to the Amazon. And then during the Civil War, this perspective changed, and their position within the broad narrative on the Amazon changed completely. They were not the heroes anymore. They were those collaborating with the guerrilla and those cultivating illicit crops. And you also have quite contested knowledge claims here. You have actors that still argue that the peasants are actually driving deforestation, but numbers show actually that it's mostly cattle ranching and agribusiness. But policies are still targeted towards peasants. So this RED Plus program supported by Germany, Norway, and UK, they focus on peasants as drivers of deforestation and not on agribusiness. And what kinds of implications has this for environmental justice? So if the focus is on peasants and not on agribusiness, is it likely that deforestation will stop? Probably not. So how much time do we have? Should we continue to Indonesia or should we allow some questions?
Okay, so we have for about 30 minutes again. So want to continue the presentation to Indonesia, or we have some question and answer first and then move to the topic of Indonesia? We have 30 minutes again. Di sini masnya
Enggak.
udah dulu.
Tidak.
Okay, so for Dr. Jonas, you have 30 minutes again. You want to continue the presentation, or we have some question answer first, and then we move to the topic of Indonesia?
If I would say if there are like one or two questions on Colombia, then it could make sense to have them now. If that's not the case, I continue.
Okay, maybe we can continue to Indonesia first, because
Okay.
we have a limitation of time. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, so let's jump to Sumatra. So we'll go to Jambi. probably some of you know Jambi a bit. I don't know, it's pretty far away from Malang, but so what I will present you now, it's mostly based on my PhD research. So it's now I would say pretty old, but I think it's still relevant. It's now, I was in Jambi in 2012, 2013 and 2016. And my PhD project focused on REDD+ and agrarian conflicts in Jambi. And I worked on the Harapan rainforest, so Hutan Harapan, and at the Berba Carbon project. So the Berba Carbon project is at the coast. The Hutan Harapan project is in inland. And my research focused on different kinds of land tenure conflicts, mostly in these areas. And Jambi, as you probably know from other parts of Indonesia, has to cope with relatively unclear land tenure and multiple conflicts. But of course, this depends on the perspective. No? If you have if you have like a spatial plan, you have obviously clear boundaries in that plan, but then you have some actors that do not recognize this plan or do not recognize the borders of the state forest because of many, many different reasons. Some of them date probably back to colonization. What is important here is that, as in many parts of Indonesia, land use and land tenure became in particular contested in the 2000s, which is to some extent associated with the decentralization process that happened after 1998. And these two projects that I investigated, so the first, the Harapan rainforest, is a project that started in 2008, which is managed by PT Reki, so PT Restorasi Ecosystem Indonesia, which is a company founded by Burung Indonesia, Royal Society for the Protection of Birds, BirdLife International, and it received financial support from the German International Climate Initiative, so from the German government, from Danida, so the Danish government, sorry, but also from companies, for example, like Singapore Airlines. Then the other project in the north, the coast, is the Berba Carbon project. It also started in 2008. It was managed by Zoological Society London, by the National Park Agency, and by the Provincial Forest Agency. And here the aim was to establish a REDD+ project that enhances the protection of the whole Berba landscape. Actually, with the Berba project, I don't know what the exact status of the project is, but I think it was not fully implemented. So that's the landscape. You have areas covered by secondary forest. You have areas used by smallholders for palm plantation within the project areas. You have large-scale commercial agribusiness outside the area. And you have, sorry, I missed the picture of the nice peat swamp forest. And I'm sure you have seen these kinds of forests. So, and there is still relatively intact peatlands, a peat swamp forest in the Berba Carbon project, which is a very nice landscape actually. So this is the setting. Of course, these projects are pretty contested. So peasants are using land within the conservation projects. Indigenous groups claim parts of these projects. The areas around the project are used by agribusiness. And land is actually getting relatively scarce in these areas. And I analyzed this conflict from a human geography perspective, from a critical human geography perspective, and I used mainly the concept of scale and actually how scales are produced, because this actually can explain in many cases how people can access natural resources. And with scale, I mean, for example, here, the scale of decision-making when it comes to land tenure. So within the Harapan Rainforest project, for example, so within this ecosystem restoration concession, village governments have issued land titles for land within the state forest. So this is one scale of decision making. And in official terms, of course, this scale doesn't exist, but the scale is produced through the everyday practices of village heads and peasants that actually use these titles when they sell land and when they access land. And also a way to legitimize land. And then the ecosystem restoration concession as such is a concession that has been issued by the Ministry of Forestry, so now Ministry of Forestry and Environment, which is a scale at the national level. And the scale is also produced by this interaction between the conservation company, Petireki, or other timber companies, for example, requesting a concession. The state is issuing this concession, and through this interaction, the scale is produced. And conflicts then often happen when scales overlap, and when you have overlapping scales of meaning and regulation. So scales of regulation, this scale are again the ways of regulating access to land, and scales of meaning are actually the ways of legitimizing these claims. So for example, peasants were arguing that land distribution is highly unequal on a national level, referring to the basic agrarian law, and therefore claiming that they're allowed to use land within the state forest. On the other hand, Petireki and the conservation NGOs, they were arguing that this is the last patch of relatively intact tropical dryland forest on Sumatra, and therefore like important for also a global heritage, and therefore referring to another scale of meaning, which reached actually at least Sumatra, then probably even the nation state, and then the globe, because it's something so important because it's under threat. And these political scales, they also constitute the division of labor, the division of labor between different public authorities. And as I explained, public authorities, as the Ministry of Forestry, or in this specific case, the village governments, they legitimize different property rights. They construct scales of regulation, and actors accessing land titles reproduce the scale of regulation. Because the title issued by a village head, so the surat sporadik, which is not necessarily something backed by a law, but in the day-to-day life in the village, this letter is actually transformed to a legal document. And this is only the case because it's accepted by the actors in the landscape, not by all, not by the Ministry of Forestry, for example, or not by the conservation NGOs, but within the villages, it is accepted. And the legitimacy of public authorities is provided by referring to endless chains of reference to bigger authorities. So for instance, the village heads were arguing, okay, I'm allowed to handle that title because I refer to the basic agrarian law. Whereas the NGOs using the conservation concession of the Hutan Harapan were arguing, I have the title issued by the national state. So that's also a way of actually creating legitimacy, is to argue that someone is bigger than you, allowed you to use that land. And this is something we do relatively short because I think you all know that. You probably don't exactly know the history of Jambi, but so of course you know that a bit, I would say, the history of Sumatra in broad terms. So in the early 20th century, the area became under Dutch rule. So it was around 1906 that Jambi was formally taken over by the Dutch, and the Dutch colonial administrative system was introduced. And this also had certain impacts that people in the landscape feel today, in particular when it comes to the Dutch jurisdictions that were implemented and that destroyed previous jurisdictions of the Sultanate and the different indigenous communities living in the area. So then we move closer to the contemporary times. What is then important is that in 1967, all the area became part of the state forest. And this also included areas that were used by village communities, by indigenous communities. And then after the fall of Suharto, we districts and village governments started to issue village scale land titles, or the district governments, not village scale land titles, but different kinds of land use concessions. And the village heads started to actually claim land within the state forest and started to allocate this land also to migrants and to the village population. And in the landscape, so this is now the Harapan Rainforest Project, we had first the colonial jurisdictions, and in the area in the past, so before the colonial times, different indigenous communities were actually organized along the watersheds. So we had different Batin groups, so the Batin Bulian, Batin Bahar, Batin Lalang groups, and they had a certain kinship structure, and they used actually the different rivers and practiced slash and burn farming along the rivers. And then the Dutch established their jurisdictions and actually redivided the land in new terms. So what you can see here is, for instance, that the Batin Lima jurisdiction here now consists parts of two watersheds, of Bulian, Sungai Bulian and Sungai Bahar, and now redividing the land and also terminating authority relations that existed in the past. So in the past, for example, a kinship leader of the Bulian group was responsible for land use decisions, and now a new authority, a new colonial authority was established. And then, as said, in 67, or this map now is from 85, the land became state forest, ignoring to some extent the presence of different communities. And this explains the conflict that actually persists still today, that actually different communities that lived since a long time within the borders of the Harapan rainforest, but also those that migrated later. And many of those that migrated later were actually invited by the village governments surrounding the areas, because they claim that these lands are part of their village territory. And this led to the situation that we have actually many, many different settlements within that protected area. And this can be traced back to this dynamic of the 2000s, when changing power constellations led to decentralization and permitted settlement formation within the state forest and within this RED projects. And in the Harapan rainforest, there are many, so I just did research on some of them. There are some more. I did research in around 5 of these settlements. And the Berber Carbon project, the situation is a bit different because also land access is more difficult. You have to drain the landscape. This is peat swamp. This is probably tidal influenced peat swamp. You need more machinery to actually establish dry land there. But even there, some settlements have been established within the state forest with the support of the district government and with the district and provincial transmigration agency. They also have established settlements within the state forest. And in both cases, the settlements, the construction of these settlements was facilitated by actor coalitions between customary leaders, migrants, local investors, NGOs, and village and district governments. So by these local state apparatuses. And for legitimizing forest conservation, actors claimed that the settlements provide land for landless farmers, for example, land for development, housing and agricultural extension for poor indigenous communities. And the idea that persists was migrants would act as model farmers, a narrative that was taken from the transmigration programs actually in the past. And even in those autonomously organized settlement projects by village governments, this idea persists that actually we take migrants from other parts of Sumatra and they will teach the population in Sumatra how to farm, the population here in this part of Jambi. And here you see a bit how these settlements look like. Some are really small. Some, this is the uniformed houses here. This is in the Berber Carbon project. These are uniformed houses built by the district transmigration agency. Then you have here a small settlement within the Hutan Harapan project. That's Alam Sakti. You have just a few houses. You have a larger one, and also in the Hutan Harapan, which is a settlement established by Serikat Petani Indonesia, so by the peasant movement. And then you have smaller, more autonomously established settlements also within the Berber Carbon Project, where people came from quite far away and brought land for quite a lot of money without actually knowing, in some cases, that this land is actually part of the state forest. No? So they were fooled by certain actors and were then actually suddenly recognized that the land that they own is actually owned by the state, no? And not by themselves. Now, showing you a bit these different actor coalitions again, there is no need to go into detail here, but what I just want to show you is that we have that actually to legitimize access to land, these complex actor coalitions were relevant. No? For example, for the conservation NGOs, it was relevant. First of all, Burg Indonesia, as you may know, had a very strong role in the formulation of the law that allowed ecosystem restoration concessions in the first place. So they lobbied for that law for a very long time, or for that regulation. So they worked closely with the Ministry of Forestry, then they received the concession and now manage this large amount of land. For the village community in Bungku, so for one of the Dusuns, Kunangan Jaya 1, they worked a lot with different NGOs. These NGOs received funding, for example, from the Ford Foundation. And thereby they managed to keep the land within the concession. And then Serikat Petani Indonesia, for example, they allied there as part of La Via Campesina, occupied parts of the area, and they were arguing that this initiative is part of their strategy and their attempt to lobby for an agrarian reform. So now I'm coming close to the end. So again, I will just raise this question shortly. Now, what kinds of environments are produced? Which practices are relevant? Which narratives are relevant? Why is ontology or knowledge contested? And which implications do we have here for environmental justice? And now I come to a short conclusion. First of all, I suggest to consider power relations, knowledge production, and ontological politics as deeply intertwined. Power and knowledge structure the multitude of ways in which actors perform reality, relate to nature, and construct borders between nature and culture. And power asymmetries might actually explain why certain natures are dominant and others might even disappear. So coming back to the example from Hamburg, for example, the nature of the fisher might eventually actually disappear if there is no fish anymore in the river. No? If they can't go for fishing, their nature will not exist anymore. And the nature of the captains of the large ocean-going vessels, of the mega vessels that call at the port, if they would stop dredging now and the shipping channel is not maintained, this would lead to the situation that they will not be able to call at the port, and then this nature of the captains will also suddenly disappear. There will be no more narratives and no more practices that reproduce this kind of nature. Then we have multiple often disruptive frontiers and specific historical causes of structural inequality that differ among places, but are at the same time common features hindering just conservation approaches. And we quite often see the social production of centers and peripheries, and this is quite relevant to understand drivers and causes of environmental conflicts. And I would like to close with this picture here of one of the endemic species along the Elbe estuary, the Elbe water dropwort. And quite funny that the environmental NGOs, they argue that, or like they say that this plant is the panda bear of the Elbe because it only grows there. It's endemic. It will be extinct if salt water will destroy their habitat. And they use it also as a symbol to organize their activities against dredging. So thank you very much for your attention. And I hope that we still have time for a number of questions.
is really insightful presentation, and it is really interesting when you talk about the Sumatra. Yeah, that's really happened in here too. There is some conflict about the land that we use in Sumatra. So for my students, for Dr. Jonasin, so in this room, I need to move because I have several students that want to ask you a question. Is that okay? So maybe my face not in the camera, but I am in the room. It's okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so any question from the student from this class? Okay, the first question.
So thank you for the chat. At first, you're talking about the RED Plus program. So my question is, how can the RED Plus program ensure that first dependent communities and first keepers in developing countries will benefit from RED Plus? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Should we collect maybe 2 or 3 questions and then that saves a bit of time? And I noted the question.
Yeah, okay. So another question. Okay. Wait.
Thank you for the opportunities. I want to ask, how much does it cost to actualize REDD, and can this idea be implemented in any country? If yes, what is the biggest challenge to actualize this idea? Thank you.
Sorry, I was not really able to fully get, how much does it cost? Could you repeat that, please?
Kedengeran nggak?
Belum speaking ya?
Nggak kedengeran. I'm sorry, we cannot hear your voice. Is there any problem in your microphone?
Yeah, I was not able to understand the question. Was like, how was it about the costs of REDD Plus or?
Oh, about the second question.
Yeah, the second question. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so for this, yeah, maybe he can repeat again the question.
Okay, I'll repeat the question. I want to ask how much does it cost to actualize the REDD, and can this idea be implemented in any country? If yes, what is the biggest challenge to actualize this idea?
So he asked about the cost or the financial that we need to give to apply the RED Plus.
Okay. So yeah, to the first question, so that was about like how to include indigenous communities and forest dwellers and things like that, and people, and yeah. So there are of course certain safeguards, but then it also depends on their implementation and on national laws, of course. And I would say that in most cases, at least in most places on paper, you have certain laws that that protect not only indigenous communities but also peasants when it comes to land use decisions. I think in most cases it's just the most important point is just to implement them. When it comes to RED Plus, yeah, so there are certain regulations or like the safeguards at the international level, but that does not necessarily change something if they're not implemented. They might be used by indigenous communities or by NGOs to raise concerns, for example, but this is then rather like a soft law mechanism and not something really legally binding. And talking about the finance, I don't have exact numbers at hand. I think there was once the number around of like 35 billion per year, but it also depends on, I would more say on domestic policy decisions. No? So it could make sense to establish an international mechanism to support some of these interventions, but forests are so important also at the national level that it's like, first of all, I would say important to like use domestic resources to protect them, and then only like second, international finance would be useful. And I'm also not so sure about the general idea of REDD as such, no? Because REDD forests only lead to additional reduction of greenhouse gas emissions if you don't use that as an offsetting mechanism. If you use REDD Plus as an offsetting mechanism, it's relatively easy to raise more funding, but it does not necessarily reduce greenhouse gas emissions, because that would mean that fossil fuel emissions will still continue, and then we conserve forests, and then the idea is that this emissions from fossil fuel-based resources will then be compensated by conservation. But what you have to keep in mind is that the forest is already there, no? So the forest is not necessarily at risk. The forest is only at risk if you develop a certain scenario that considers the forest for being at risk to create carbon credits. So through a market mechanism, there might be opportunities to raise quite a lot of funding, but this will not reduce greenhouse gas emissions. It might only help to like stabilize them. And for actually saving the climate, I think much more radical approaches would be useful. And this would just mean that we have to like come to certain decisions, first of all, locally, nationally, and globally, and vice versa. And this would, from my perspective, rather mean like to find ways where we can conserve areas, where we can use areas for the production of crops, and where we can find ways to actually bring both together, so that we don't necessarily separate landscapes with like we have an area for oil palm, we have an area for animals, we have an area for rubber cultivation, but that we find ways, design agroforestry systems, for example, in a way that we can use them for, that we can maybe find different ways of growing oil palm with more biodiversity, because we don't have the place, no, to just conserve all the landscapes. People have to eat something, people need vegetable oils. Yeah, this is something quite difficult. And I think it's not, there's, even if we would say we have 100 billion euros per year, no? The problem is, what should people eat? So you cannot just like say, okay, we invest more money in conservation, but where do we produce our food?
Yeah. Thank you for Dr. Janasi. Yeah, it is really quite interesting question, right? About the cost that we need to give, or financial that we need to have to implement the REDD Plus itself, when we know about the function and the impact of REDD Plus itself for the conservation of our nature or our environmental. Is that okay? Is one last question again?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So, is there any question again on the last one? Last question. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you. My question is, in my hometown, to be exactly Central Kalimantan, there are a lot of forests. Maybe have the same problem in Jambi about agrarian. Can be FDD plus to solve the problem in my hometown, exactly Central Kalimantan? Thank you.
Sorry, it's very difficult. We also have the same problems in Germany when we use hybrid formats. It's difficult to understand. Maybe type it in the chat, and then I can just read it. Is that possible? That's maybe or
Yeah.
Try once
So
more.
to hear my voice clearly.
Yes.
Yeah. So the question is, actually, he is come from Central Kalimantan, one of the province in Indonesia. So he asked that if the red plus can solve the problem that occur in Central Kalimantan, which is the same, the Jambi itself, the problem that occurs in Jambi. So he asked, is there any chance or any possibility that red plus can also solve the same problem that occurred in the Central Kalimantan?
Okay, yeah, no, I don't think so. Frankly, I have to say I don't think so, because one of the problems with Red Plus is that it's not targeting the drivers of deforestation. So there are certain reasons why the forests of Kalimantan, the forests of Sumatra are converted into areas used for oil palm, areas used for the production of other crops. And this is because there is a national, a global, a regional demand for these crops. And this demand was rising the last years. At the same time, also for peasants, oil palm, for example, has the reputation of a modern crop, of a crop that brings you a certain welfare effect, that may allow you to bring your children to university and things like that. A crop that is also a symbol for a better living. So there's also these meanings that are important when talking about oil palm. That's not only about profit. But the profit dimension is, of course, relevant when it comes to drivers of deforestation. So as long as there is no way to solve these drivers, then there will be a demand. So, and with a financial mechanism, you cannot necessarily solve the drivers. Of course, you can say, we find a carbon price that covers the opportunity costs of oil palm cultivation, so that you pay actually people so much money that they would earn the same amount of money they would earn with an oil palm cultivation. But there is still the demand. So either the oil palm price would rise then, or the palm oil price would rise, making it again more difficult to compensate those, or production would just be displaced to other areas. This is, of course, a very pessimistic view, no? But I don't see that you can find solutions with these kind of economic instruments alone. You would need strong regulations, and you would need ways to bring different land use techniques together. No? Because we need vegetable oil. We also, out of ethical reasons, also because we benefit quite a lot from ecosystem services from species, we want to protect them. They're also part of our heritage. No, why do we have the rights to survive and not animals and plants? No? So we should find ways to bring that all together, and that means, of course, also that we have to change our consumption patterns. No? So, and times really have changed. It's not that you can say nowadays that it's about the life of the people living in Hamburg or New York that have to change their consumption patterns. It's the same for people in the emerging economies. We have very unsustainable consumption patterns. No, just imagine the amount of shopping malls in Jakarta where you can buy useless stuff. No? Nobody needs these things that you can buy there. No? And we all like to go there, no? To make shopping. We all want to have our brand new mobile phone every year, every 2 years, every 3 years. No? And that's just not necessary. And this, of course, does not directly relate to palm oil, but this is just something we needed to change our mindsets there a bit. And then we can reduce demand. Or if we change our when it comes to food consumption, no? If we eat less meat, then we need less soy. And then we need probably less land for soy production. And that's, I think, the way how things might work a bit, but not only with creating financial incentives. So just think about when you next time want to buy a mobile phone, or maybe you can buy a second-hand phone, or maybe you just think, okay, my phone makes it 1 year more.
Yeah, okay. So the keyword is about how we change the mindset of the community itself, right? Okay. So
not only of the communities, of all of us.
Oh, all of us. Okay.
Yes.
So this is the really interesting for us, because when we talk about the mindset itself, it's kind of hard to change our mindset. And for myself, it is really hard to how to change mindset about the about my consumption, about my decision to make a consumption. Yeah, and so this is a really last question. So I look at the chat, and there is one question for you. So I think this is really interesting for all of the students. So that is the question from Mrs. Rizka Maria. She asked about if knowledge is contested and position actor is also important in political ecology, then how do we accommodate local knowledge and local wisdom of indigenous groups in forest management? And who has the strongest power to stop the destruction of the environment if we use the theory of political ecology?
Okay, yeah, these are two tough questions, I would say. Like the first one, so of course there are ways to do that, no? That have been used also in Indonesia when it comes like to management committees for national parks or so. No? There is also an interesting approach by Whitmore on how to integrate actually lay people's knowledge into environmental modeling. I will share you the paper on the Elbe estuary that I just published in Environment and Planning. I will send that later so that you can share that with all people, and a number of other publications. So there are ways to do that, and one of the important aspects is that you consider this local knowledge as important as scientific knowledge. No? And that, of course, depends also on the field as such. No? If it's about the survival of a certain tree species in an area, you can, of course, make your measurements, your biophysical, but also you need experience. And this experience always comes from those people that live in an area for a long time. And then there are multiple ways to do that, through management committees, but also through like modeling exercises where you consider these kinds of knowledge within modeling. And the second question, who has the strongest power to disrupt the destruction of the environment? That's of course a difficult question. Like when you are living in as most of us are doing, I would say, in a capitalist state, you have the state consists of different ministries, for example, and these different ministries, they are, of course, also reflecting the interests of different groups in society. No? So, for example, in the Ministry of Environment, usually you have people that have a more green mindset, I would say, because there are people that have been trained in maybe in human geography, maybe in biology and ecology. Maybe they have worked for WALHI, then they move to the ministry, or here in Germany for Friends of the Earth Germany. So they have a certain greener mindset. Then you have maybe in Germany, like the Ministry of Economy, which is strongly influenced by the car manufacturers. In Indonesia, you have maybe the Ministry for Agriculture, which is more influenced by agribusiness. So you have these different actors that are able to inscribe their interests also in the state. And then the decisions might also contradict each other. And sometimes the Ministry of Environment is doing something, then the Ministry of Economy is saying, no, we're doing something else. That really depends on the context and on the power relations within society as such. No? So there might be places where, for instance, Costa Rica is quite often taken as an example when it comes to forest conservation, where the important actors in society agreed that for the country it's very important to protect forests because, for example, ecotourism was such an important economic activity. So there was a certain time where there was a strong agreement in society that we protect our forest. And then we look, we have certain areas that are available for agriculture, but we protect forests. And then at the end, Costa Rica is still able to keep its forest. But for example, in Germany is always arguing against stricter environmental regulation when it comes to car production, to automobile production. Because the German car industry is so influential within the German state. And I would assume that in Indonesia, you have a relatively similar situation with the oil palm business. This is just because these sectors in the economy are so important for welfare, for example. No? So there's just a complicated, not really answer, just some guessing to that question. No? So it really depends on the actor coalition. The answer is also different probably from region to region. No? If there is a region where ecotourism is very strong, there might be a different response to that question, that then, okay, the local provincial forest agency together with actor XYZ is strong enough to support environmental conservation. While in another area, for instance, around the Elbe estuary in Hamburg, it's much more important for the economy to keep the port, and the environmental actors are rather marginalized, are not able actually to influence the state in such a way that the estuary is protected in an adequate way.
Yeah, thank you for Dr. Jonathan. I think that is very last question for today's guest lecturing. And so for today's guest lecturing, I think this is the last for the presentation in question and answer. So it is really grateful for us that you can share your knowledge, actually, especially about the agrarian conflict that occurred in Sumatra, in Jambi itself. And it is really insightful knowledge for all of the students and broaden their knowledge about the agrarian conflict itself. So it is really grateful for us, and we are really thank you for your presentation today. It is really wonderful. And because this is our last session, maybe we can maybe you can end your screen first.
Yes, sorry. Yeah.
So I thought that maybe you want another presentation, but somehow we have a limitation in time because some students need to join to another class after this at 3 p.m. So for the last session, maybe we can take a picture together because there are some students joining us in the Zoom and some students join us in offline. So maybe we will spotlight your video and then we will take a picture. Is that okay? Yeah, okay.
Tak capture dari sini, Mbak. Tak capture dari sini.
Maksudnya kita berdiri di sini terus jurnalisnya di belakang.
Oh gitu. Oke.
Saya spotlight ya.
Iya.
Yang mana saya ini dulu. Ya. Ayo silakan siap-siap.
Spotlight ya.
Oke, saya spotlight. Ayo kita maju di depan, kita foto. Setelah itu saya bagi. Ayo move ini namanya sebelum. So I'm sorry.
It is actually we need to move to the in front to all students, so we need some time. Okay, but we will move quick.
Siapa yang di depan? Ayo dek. Jadi, kayaknya kelihatan Mas yang di belakang. Foto videonya kelihatan. Ya kayaknya agak. Oh iya. Gimana? Sebentar. Bisa gimana? Sudah ya Mas ya? Oke.
Satu, dua, kayak jempol.
Coba ya Mas ya.
Ada satu, dua, video.
Gimana Mas?
Tani Joyo. Satu, dua,
Cheese.
salam.
Kasih ya. Okay, so
thank you for the journalism. So actually, my students really happy to take picture with you.
Yeah,
So
thanks for the invitation again.
Yeah, so I hope next year you can join us in here in University
Yes,
of Pertanian.
I hope so.
So actually, it is your second time, right? Join us in the 3-in-1 program. So I hope that maybe next year, if you have any time, you can join us again in 3-in-1 program, and you can come to Brawijaya and see how beautiful Malang is.
Yeah,
Okay,
great.
thank you very much.
Sounds good.
Yeah.
So have a nice afternoon.
Yeah. Okay, so thank you very much, and we will see you again.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Bye.
Okay, thank you. Bye. See you next time.
Thank you.